Donald Trump is going to court. He's still challenging the vote counting in several counties, right?
And processes.
And states and processes that, that have happened. On the other hand, Joe Biden is already saying, I'm ready to go. I've removed my jacket. I'm ready to start working. I can't wait for January to come so that I'm inaugurated and I move into the White House and I get down to business. The Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, has said, all preparations are being made for the transition to the second term of President Trump. Someone saying he was saying it in jest, but he's the Secretary of State in the President Trump administration. But he went ahead to say there are cases that, there are challenges that have been raised and we're pursuing those challenges. But at the same time, when the American election was taking place, several elections are taking place in Africa. Ivory Coast, other parts. Tanzania. And, Mike Pompeo released a statement talking about the need for us to observe democracy and the tenets of democracy and people to follow the law, the laid out procedures of an election and ensure that you abide by them and allow international observers to come in and listen to what the people are saying. And at the end of the day, let the will of the people reign. That is what shall hold supreme. As he's talking about that, what's happening in his own backyard.
Not even his backyard, just the bathroom.
Right there.
Yeah.
In his own government. What is happening? So, such like when he tweeted that, actually, when that statement was tweeted by the Department of State, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton tweeted a very nice rejoinder. He said, what did she say? It was what irony. She basically just said how ironic this statement sounds, looking at what you're telling other third world countries and looking at what this government is doing in this own country. So the question then emerges, does America have Veney now? Can it hold a light to anyone and tell them, the tenets and rules of democracy?
Yes, they can actually.
Why?
Simply because those rules that they keep talking about also applies to them. We seem to be reacting from the fact that those rules don't apply because they adhere to them. But we forget one simple fact. Americans are human beings. And what we are seeing is human beings at their very best, not worst. I don't think the president is actually doing anything that, in my opinion, is untoward. He is challenging an election. He has the right to challenge an election.
Right.
He has the right to point out things that he thinks are wrong. The rejoinder of all this has been no evidence. But if a case is in court, I presume at some point evidence will be asked for and will be provided for. He doesn't need to provide evidence to the media. He doesn't need to provide evidence to anybody else. So if we're to go simply by the tenets of democracy as practiced in this great country of America, then I would say that the president is within his rights. He also has rights, like every other citizen, to launch whatever he's launching. He has every right to take issues to court. If he was unhappy about some aspects of the processes, he claims to have witnesses who will corroborate his views, then I will calmly wait to hear what the judges in these cases have to say about his allegations.
The irony here is that many times when a similar thing would happen, where a sitting president in a third world country, in Africa, for instance, would be there saying, no, wait, I cannot hand over the reins of power yet because we still have to look at how this election was conducted and the challenges therein. The statement would come out clearly from the State Department in the United States talking about, the need for people to respect the will of the people, even without regarding that there is a due process in that country to be followed. And maybe the government is there saying, we're going to follow the due process.
You see, you must understand
it's
that...
like, preach water, drink water.
Eric, we are talking about politics and politicians, right? They are given an extraordinary allowance for hypocrisy, okay?
Yeah.
They can say things they don't mean. They can even lie outrightly. Because they are politicians, we don't set a very high standard for them. Now, what we seem to be discussing here is these are standards that it was assumed were only present in third world leaders. And probably the shock and horror is that a president of the leading democratic country in the world is exhibiting traits that were hitherto thought to be merely the province of those who are in third world banana republic type countries. Now, that is where the term embarrassment comes in, because how is it that we who are thought to have been beyond this are now exhibiting the same things that we've been preaching for the longest time that we are beyond and that we will never portray?
Sure. I mean, that's where the shock comes in. That's where the shock and comes in, because, I mean, not too long ago, I mean, just as you said, countries on the African continent that went through elections, the call was, recognize if there is a winner, step down and allow democracy to continue. Sanctions had been placed on other countries where leaders were thought to be going against the will of the people and delegitimizing, I get that word, the process of an election, right? And sanctions were placed on them. The same individual in this case, who would have put out that word, now is essentially refusing, regardless of whatever is brought to the table that could be fact. Yes, it is well within his right. It's well within his right to do so. But the optics of it actually don't really look good.
Has he broken any law?
No, he hasn't.
No, he hasn't. That's why I said it's the optics that don't look good at this point.
Just like in African countries, nobody breaks the law.
Nobody breaks the law.
Excuse me, I don't understand that. I thought that's what we do frequently.
No, but here, when somebody is challenging the results of an election, have they broken the law by challenging the results? Have they broken the law by saying that they want to go to the courts to have the result challenged? No, they've not broken the law.
Anyway,
but why is the sentiment coming out?
As we continue the conversation, let's bring in experts and people who are scholars on these matters. Professor Paul Tiyambe is the Vice Chancellor and a Professor of Humanities and Social Sciences at the USIU Africa. And we also have Professor Cassandra Veney, who is the Chair in the Department of International Relations at USIU Africa. Good morning, Professors.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for joining us, and it's good to have you on the show. I'm going to just start off with you, Professor Tiyambe. The statements and the activities that we've seen in America, not just during this election, but in the last 4 years. In the last 4 years, we've seen people who voted for Donald Trump. You've seen people, again, who have voted for Donald Trump again, maybe even new people who voted for Donald Trump. And on the other side, the opposition is describing Donald Trump as, this tyrannical leader, this person who doesn't deserve to be in office, this person who's behaving as if he is not even fit to be a human being and all. And this is a kind of sentiment, and that's what we were discussing in our intro. This is a kind of sentiment that's, passed on several African leaders. Said that this person has actually not even just won an election, but he's forced his way into office. He does not even deserve to be considered a prefect in a schoolyard. What do you say to that?
I think it is important to understand that currently, of course, and for some time, the United States has been a very polarized society, politically and otherwise. And with regards to Mr. Trump, you will note that in 2016, he won the electoral college, but he did not win the popular vote. So what that points to is that the United States has some inherent flaws in terms of its democratic system. One is the fact that the president is not directly elected by the people. Rather, the electoral college determines who become president. So you can have a leader like Senator Clinton in 2016 who won the popular vote by almost 3 million and lost the election. And then you also remember in 2000, President George Bush became the president, but he actually lost the popular vote to Vice President Al Gore by about 500,000 votes. The difference in terms of the electoral vote came from Florida, and the difference was 537 votes. So the electoral system in the United States is one in which, the way we understand democracy, somebody who has won the popular vote does not apply. There are other features of U.S. democracy that are problematic. The other one being, of course, voter suppression, in which there are determined efforts to prevent some citizens, particularly minorities, African Americans and others, from voting. There is also the problem of gerrymandering, in which the electoral districts are defined by the political parties rather than by a neutral body. And then, of course, there is finally the politicization of the judiciary. And this is how Mr. Bush won in 2000. The Supreme Court, determined that the voting should stop. So what you have in the U.S., yes, on paper it's a democracy. In reality, there are a lot of deficits to that democratic system, certainly in comparison to other Western democracies in Europe, Canada, Australia, and the emerging democracies in Africa.
If I were to go by just the example you've given of the Bush and Al Gore election, there are those who explain that their process of determining the viability of those votes took something like 38 days. And still, there were cases where they couldn't determine whether those things could actually be considered as legitimate votes or not. And it's because of that that the Supreme Court, again, the Supreme Court decision was that you stop the counting. Now, if we were to go by the fact that it had to go to the Supreme Court for the decision to be made, are we then saying that the system is flawed, or are we then saying that the backup system that's supposed to arbitrate is flawed?
I think, there is a big difference between 2000 and 2020. One of the big differences is obviously the fact that the claims by the Trump team is that these, the flaws are in the states that, Mr. Biden has won, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and so on. The flaws are not in the states where they have won. And this is across the whole country in that sense. So it is, they're really trying to make an argument which doesn't hold water. To begin with, a lot of, the electoral system in the United States, again, part of its complexity is that this is done at the state level. And, while it might happen in one particular state, in the case of 2000, and even for the 2000, it was in one particular area. This, the claim that the entire electoral system is, problematic in terms of rigging and so on is simply untenable. Mr. Trump, of course, is trying his best to, flog a horse that is already dead in terms of his own electoral chances. And there is no possibility whatsoever that he can win that case. The New York Times just published yesterday, for example, a report that, they looked at every state in the country, and there is simply no evidence of electoral fraud, as Mr. Trump is claiming.
If we can go to you, Professor Veney, and asking ourselves now where things stand and the several court cases that are being filed from yesterday in the United States to the day before, even as early as Monday. What does this mean then for the system? For an election where votes are still being counted at the moment in different states. I believe Arizona just finished. Pennsylvania is still on there. Georgia, an entire new count then has been ordered. What does this mean for the legitimacy of this particular election or any other that may come in the future? What does this mean looking at the United States from your point of view?
Thank you. I think as we know that, as the previous comment said, before Professor Zalaza, that the president has every right to go to court. If these court cases come to fruition and these votes are still being counted, to me it's a legal aspect of it, that he has gone to court, that these votes, he wants them to continue to be counted. But as Professor Zalaza said, there really, to this date, doesn't seem to be any evidence that the votes were counted in a fraudulent manner, that even if there's a recount, that it will totally change the outcome of the election. So what this means is that it's a legal process that can take place, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it will change anything.
But it doesn't have to change anything. The fact is that he's allowed to go through the process, and the fact is he's allowed then to present what he's supposed to be presenting. And I think the issue and the question that CT had even asked earlier is this showing weakness in the system, or is it showing that the system actually does work and it should then be allowed to work? There's an electoral process, there's a voting system, there's a counting, there's a challenge, and there's a body that is mandated to be the one that mediates whenever there's a dispute. Is that not showing that there is actually a proper system that's working?
I think, again, I think he has every right to go through the process. It just seems to me that a lot of Americans, enough of them, not necessarily a lot, enough of them did not vote for him. As Professor Zaleza said, Hillary Clinton received the popular vote, but she was not elected.
Yep.
He did not receive, to date, the popular vote. So after 4 years of acrimony and hostility and driving the country into the ground, to me, it's beyond a legal thing. It's for the greater good. It ought to be, what can we do to bring the country back together? What can we do to stop all of this acrimony and hostility? And again, it speaks volumes about the president as a person, as a leader, or not being able to be a leader. That he's just kicking the can down the road, if you will. He has lost, as far as everybody can say and see, but yet he still wants to drag this out through the legal process.
I think, Professor, what you're saying is, well, a view that you hold and a view that many others hold, but there are also very many others who also hold the other view, that he hasn't lost, or he hasn't lost fairly. The Trump campaign, for example, is claiming, and I've just seen an item on Fox News, that they've even come up with a list of supposed dead people who are said to have participated in this vote.
Well, as you said, if it goes, or somebody said, if it goes through the court process, then that evidence will be brought forward. So if he's insisting on letting it be decided by the court, then that evidence will be in the court. And maybe people are wrong. Maybe there has been some evidence of fraud. But as we sit here now, there hasn't been any evidence. And as Professor Zaleza said, those same people who will say there's fraud in this election or fraud in previous elections will still come back and say there's no such thing as voter suppression. There's no such thing as shutting down ballot boxes in Harris County, which is a huge county in Texas. So what if you don't let people who've already served their sentences vote? So what if you don't let ex-felons vote? That's okay. So it's a situation of the Republicans in particular calling out certain things, but not calling out certain things which doesn't suit their interests.
I mean, I begin to get the impression that here, the view that seems to be gaining currency is that President Trump is actually not even fighting the Democratic Party, he's fighting the system. Because the system, as from what I hear, is that it's a system that is known to work, has worked, and the flaws that it may have are minimum to the point where even when they're evidence, they don't really change any outcome. So, if indeed the president is fighting the system, do you really think that he has a right to fight the system?
Go ahead, Professor Zaleza.
I was going to say that what Mr. Trump is doing is trying to undermine Americans' faith in the electoral system because he has lost. He did not complain when he won by a whisker in 2016. This is the attitude of a sore loser, and he's doing a very dangerous thing for American democracy with all its limits. And in terms of the people, there was a recent poll which indicates 80% of Americans are like, you know what, this is over. You have lost the elections. Please just accept and let's move on. There's no indication that if all these cases come to court, there will be any substantial changes in the electoral outcome. So what he's doing is simply sour grapes by somebody who cannot stand losing. For him, as you know, one of his most epithets is to call somebody a loser. And the idea that he could have lost the election, the gap between him and Mr. Biden is now increasing as more votes are counted. It's now about 5 million, and there is no way that would change. So what we are seeing here is not somebody who is trying to promote the integrity of the electoral system in the United States. Instead, he's trying to introduce doubt which he has been doing all along in the interest of his supporters who are determined not to accept a Democrat, in this case, of course, Mr. Biden, being the next president.
Talking about America, and from what we've seen, the 4 years of President Donald Trump and now this election, has the U.S. lost its moral authority? Has the U.S. lost its moral authority under Donald Trump?
Well done.
How many hours are those? Has the U.S. lost its moral authority under Trump? That's what I meant to say. On www.spicefm.co.ke, in the room is Eric Latif Nduoko, CT Muga. Joining us on the line is Professor Paul Zeleza. He's the Vice Chancellor at USIU Africa. He's also Professor of Humanities and Social Sciences. And Professor Cassandra Veney, who is the Chair of the Department of International Relations at USIU Africa. Has the U.S. lost its moral authority under Trump? 2016. Donald Trump wins the election through the electoral college votes, does not win the election through the popular vote, and we see Democrats pouring out in the streets, and there were demonstrations for a couple of weeks. Now it's the shoe is on the other foot. Donald Trump, still doesn't appear to have won the popular vote and does not appear to have won the college votes, but he's contesting that election and the process of the election. We are seeing some Democrats and Republicans out on the streets. In fact, Republicans are said to be, calling out for a 1 million-man march on Washington, D.C. When this happens in Africa, what is discussed about this? That, you're out there, you're protesting, somebody should be conceding defeat and calling their supporters to order and telling their supporters to go back home and just saying, I've accepted, so let me also now talk to my supporters. It's the same thing that's happening in the States.
Yeah,
what does that mean?
On this side of the water is a totally different narrative than that is coined when such things happen. So then I want to ask that direct question. I think both of you, Professor Veney and Professor Zeleza, has the U.S. lost its moral authority to be able to point fingers at the rest of the world based on what is happening there at the moment? Has it lost its moral authority?
I can start.
Yes.
I think what we're asking, not necessarily the moral authority in terms of something that's personal. I would say the political moral authority. Now, we can just talk about Trump. We can isolate Trump. We can isolate what's happening now. And if we do that, we miss out on a big picture. In order for us to understand what is happening in the United States within the context of the United States calling people out or having any type of authority to pull somebody else's coattail to tell them that they're not doing something correctly politically, we need to understand why we even think that the United States has a moral authority, because it does not have had one from the beginning. If you look at when the United States became a country, it had the opportunity right then and there in 1789 to say, we're going to start this country with moral authority. We're going to have liberty. We're going to have justice. We're going to have democracy. We're going to carry out all of those things that Thomas Jefferson wrote about in the Declaration of Independence. But they didn't do that then. They firmly codified slavery into law and put people of African descent into the Constitution as 3/5 of a person. That should have been a red flag, that there will not be any moral authority. And after the Civil War, after 1865, when the 13th Amendment was added to the Constitution that freed these 4 million people who were enslaved, just to have slavery itself, you need to ask yourself, what leg of moral authority did the United States ever have to stand on? So you had this window of opportunity after 1865, this window of opportunity called Reconstruction, and you passed these Reconstruction Amendments. And you need to ask yourself, not you personally, but we need to ask ourselves, what kind of moral authority can a country have when it has to add amendments onto the Constitution to free people, to give them citizenship, to give them voting rights? Red flags should have been swirling around all over. So again, Reconstruction was that moment of time when these things that were a part of the Constitution should have been carried out. And then maybe starting from that point onward, the United States could have begun to have some type of moral authority. Reconstruction ended, and you have this infamous Supreme Court case called Plessy versus Ferguson that, again, codified into law segregation. Mm-hmm. And the national government did what it could to try to get rid of domestic terrorism, mm-hmm. but it was just rampant. So again, starting from the beginning, there was no moral authority. So fast forward to the year 2020, you still don't have the moral authority. The United States has gone around telling people they should do this, telling people should do that. But when you unpeel that onion, you understand that it should have never had any moral authority. And people throughout the globe gave it moral authority because perhaps they didn't quite understand the political, racial history of that country.
So then we can say that I think before I ask my next question, Professor Zeleza, you can give your input on this. Has the U.S. lost its moral authority, or do you agree with Professor Veney?
I agree with Professor Veney that the United States, from the very beginning, has never had the kind of moral authority that it has been given and that it has advertised for itself in terms of the right of people to exercise their liberties, to exercise their rights as citizens, as voters. As we all know, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, did not come until 1964 and 1965. And even with that, the attempts to prevent people of African descent and other minorities from exercising their full political and economic rights, and of course women, has been rampant. And the unfortunate thing is that because it's a superpower, militarily and economically, people have invested that country with a moral authority that it does not have and it has never had. And Trump, in a very fundamental way, is not an exception in American history. Trump is really simply brought to light the deformities and the dysfunctions of American politics, of American society. He spoke loudly what already happens in that society in terms of the racism, in terms of the misogyny, and so on and so forth. So what he has done is simply, of course, accelerate the demise of Pax Americana and tarnish the American democracy in a way that people who are outside the country, perhaps did not fully understand. Yeah. He has brought all that to light.
And even, go ahead, Prof.
Okay, can I add this? I think oftentimes we in the United States and outside of the United States, when there is a presidential election, we put all the emphasis on the presidential election. That is an important election. There's no doubt about it. However, the election at the state level for the Senate, and as Professor Zeleza pointed out, gerrymandering for the House, not the Senate, but the House, and those state legislative districts, those things need to be brought about as well. The national election in terms of the president, that is important. However, there are all kinds of issues that are decided at the state and local level that will affect you day to day that are just as important. And when you leave people out of those decisions, then you really don't have a democracy. The other point I want to make is that oftentimes, absolutely, African Americans get the bulk of the media exposure. We know about them. We know their history and whatnot. However, to be fair, we need to bring in the indigenous people to that country. Yep. The men of that community were not given citizenship until after World War I, and it wasn't all of them. Those were only the men who participated in World War I. So again, let me emphasize, if you have to add amendments to the Constitution, if you have to have congressional acts, such as the Indian Citizenship Act, and as Professor Zeleza pointed out, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and in addition to that, you had a number of court cases. To give people the right to vote, that should make anybody question. And 1965 wasn't that long ago. And in addition to that, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is up to be looked at every 10 years. That should give you reason to pause. First off, you shouldn't have one, and it shouldn't be any discussion about extending it or renewing it every 10 years.
If I were to look and if I were to surmise and understand the comments that I've heard being made about President Trump, and if I were to look at the history that you've outlined so very clearly, it means that these are issues that it's not that they've never simply gone away. People have learned to cope with them. There have been changes. There have been positive moves. But until Trump, you haven't had a president who's been able to bring out all these issues right out into the open for everyone to see with clarity.
Right.
So the complaint about Trump should be a praise for Trump, because this is a man who has put aside hypocrisy and actually walked around stark naked for everyone to see exactly who he is.
And who he represents.
I think he has exposed. It does not mean that we cannot critique Trump himself for his lies, for the scandals, and the ways in which he has undermined, the limited democracy in that country. But he's definitely exposed, and some of the underbelly of the United States, and exposed the people of the country as well as the rest of the world. Make them lose their naivety about the United States, and that false sense of innocence, of perfection, that this is the model that we should all follow. That has become quite evident that it's not. So for that, obviously, the Trump administration has historically been useful in exposing that. It doesn't mean that what they have been doing for the last 4 years has promoted the interest of the majority of that country's citizens.
But Professor Zaleza, it doesn't appear.
Please go ahead.
Can I add to that?
Yes.
I think that Professor Zaleza is absolutely positively correct. However, let me add to that. For those of us, and I'm a part of the African American community, so for those of us who have personally and professionally and historically experienced that, we're not surprised. What we find very interesting, and we're not even surprised by what I'm about to say, but what we find very interesting is that how other people seem not to know. They seem to be unaware. And so if you're on the receiving end of racism and discrimination, you're sitting there looking at yourself, why is it that I understand it and you're doing it to me, but you, for some reason, don't understand it?
How would you explain? Is this ignorance real or is it feigned?
I'm sorry.
I'm asking the question that the ignorance that people have. I mean, someone is practicing discrimination, and yet at the same time, they don't seem to understand that they're actually being discriminatory. Is this something that people put on? Is this something that they really are ignorant about these facts?
I think people understand what they're doing. Certainly, in the United States, we have seen through the George Floyd movement that people understand that there is systemic racism, that white supremacy is a powerful force in that country. People understand that. And of course, the levels of understanding vary from community to community. If you are at the receiving end, as Professor Veney said, of racism, of course, it's not just a question of understanding it, you experience it daily. And just like President Kaunda used to say in the days of apartheid, you did not need a Russian, or, as the, leaders of South Africa at that time used to say, that the people in South Africa, are being influenced by the Russians, the communists, in order to oppose this nice system called apartheid. He used to say the ordinary man and woman and a black child in South Africa understood because they experienced it. Now, the other people may be in denial. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, or that they even understand that they are beneficiaries of that system. Where the problem comes is, I think, internationally, and there are all sorts of reasons. The Western world has a vested interest in promoting a certain image of the West in the world, including the United States, in which they are the paragons, they are the models of democracy, they are the models of everything that has happened that is good for humanity. And then the rest of us, unfortunately, through the media, through our educational systems, we perpetuate those ideas, sometimes knowingly, sometimes unknowingly, because we valorize whiteness, we valorize colonialism, we valorize imperialism insofar as we put them on the pedestal of what it is to be developed, what it is to have reached a level of civilization. So there is a willfulness, but there is also a deep ignorance in the process in which all of us are caught up in that system in which the United States becomes a model. And of course, the US is a superpower. And anybody who is very strong, you think they must be also good. It doesn't follow.
So then, has the United States been following this democratic model, Professor Veney, from all the things that you've said, that it shouldn't come as a surprise that that people are going through this because people have lived the experience, right? So you actually shouldn't be surprised. So is the United States democratic? Is it a democratic country?
In many ways it is, and in many ways it is not, because the way the president is elected, again, I'm not going to go into any type of long, drawn-out political lesson, but the very reason that the president is elected by the Electoral College and not by direct vote is something that is questionable. For me, as a political scientist, it means that from the beginning, the highest office that it has become over time, and as Professor Zaleza points out, what we want the world to think, that the United States is the biggest democracy besides India, the president is the leader of the democratic world. Again, like Professor Zaleza says, if the world wants to believe that, fine, but let's go back a little bit. The president of the United States from the beginning, in terms of quote unquote the founding fathers, was not going to be elected by popular vote, was not going to be elected by the people, or else why would you have this convoluted system called the Electoral College? And at the time that the United States became the United States in 1789, only those people who could vote were white men who owned property. And of course, that property also could be slaves. So from the very beginning, it was not a democracy. It was never meant to be a democracy within the context of all people who were citizens or who met basic voting criteria would be able to vote. And I always tell my students this should give you a clue as well. The Constitution went into effect in 1789. The first Congress met in 1790. The first piece of legislation passed by that Congress was the Naturalization Act, the 1790 Naturalization Act, that said only those people would become citizens through naturalization. Only those people who could do that had to be white. So from the very beginning, power, political power, economic power was going to be conferred upon white men with property, not even indentured servants, not even poor white people, not even white women. So the writing is on the wall that it was never meant to be a democracy. I would make the argument that it has made steps, there's no doubt about it. And it probably to this day is on the road to achieving full democracy, but there is no way I would say that the United States is a democracy. It has too many flaws. It has too many systemic and institutional and structural ways by which it continues to not allow people to participate.
So if it isn't a democracy, what would you call it?
I think it's a dominant democratic system.
Okay.
And maybe just to add another thing on that one, when you look at the other level of government, which is the Senate, every state has, of course, 2 senators, and there are, as you know, 50 states. What that does is that take a state like Wyoming, which has about 579,000 residents. Wyoming has as much weight as California, which has 39 million people. So by definition, the Senate is actually dominated by a minority of American citizens, insofar as it's based on the formula of the representation by the states. And the states are not equal in terms of population. And it's the Senate that is going to be the one making approvals for the Supreme Court and so on, which then will sit in judgment. So the entire structure has very deep flaws that sort of mitigate against the realization of democracy.
Is that necessarily a flaw, Professor, or is it just a way of ensuring that there is equity and distribution of influence across the states?
Well,
if you have for example, in this country for the first 5 years or 4 years of this administration, the buzzword in the country was tyranny of numbers, and the thinking is that you get a certain block of tribal voters, and you combine it with another certain block of tribal voters, then you're able to carry the presidency. That then does not sound like it's representative, does it? But now, if you look at what you're talking about, this system in the states, a small state and a big state are all American, and therefore they all deserve representation.
Yeah, of course, representation can be seen in terms of territory. Representation can also be seen in terms of population. But if it's purely based on territory, like the Senate is, then of course you are going to increasingly disenfranchise people in certain areas. In a comparison between Wyoming with its 579 and 39 million is blatantly unequal. It means that, and that's why you have this notion of the battleground state.
Yeah.
You never hear about California or New York being battleground states because those are given that they will go to the Democrats. What you then end up is battling over very few states, which also means that, in fact, the election is not decided nationally in that sense. It's decided by these areas which tend to be limited in terms of numbers. And many of those states happen to be rural, happen to be predominantly white. So you are reinforcing the racial division in that country in terms of representation. You are also reinforcing the disenfranchisement, as it were, in terms of proportionality of people who happen to be urban and in some cases suburban.
Professor, would you then say that this American system is pre-rigged?
Yes, it is. It is. Yes, it's baked into the system. As Professor Veney said, the system was not meant to be a democracy the way we understand democracy. And the tragedy is that the American economy, over the last 250 years, has grown to become, obviously, what we know it to do today. The political system has not grown to match not only the economic growth, but also the changes in that society, demographically, politically, and otherwise. So you have a very modern economy. In fact, the world's richest country. Grafted on top of it is a very antediluvian political system. And that's why you are seeing all these dysfunctions that the Trump presidency has brought out into the open.
Professor, thank you very much for speaking to us. Professor Paul Zeleza is the Vice Chancellor at the USIU. He's also Professor of Humanities and Social Sciences. And Professor Cassandra Veney is also Chair of the Department of International Relations at the USIU. Asanteni sana for speaking to us, and we wish you a great day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
No, thank you very much.